Welcome to Lecture 23. This week we'll be looking at externalities. Following up from the last 2 weeks where we have been looking at the perfectly competitive markets, we said that the perfectly competitive market is Pareto efficient as long as there are no external effects. Another term for external effects is externalities. So let us go into defining what are externalities and see how the occurrence of externalities impact the perfectly competitive market. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to say whether or not a perfectly competitive market with an externality is efficient or inefficient. Where's that from and who made it? The idea is that we have availability of a lot of goods and services. We don't necessarily know where it is from or who made it, but what we are presented with is a market in which we can carry out our transactions. A market is simply a bringing together of buyers and sellers, and where goods are traded between these buyers and sellers. Market magic is the idea that the market may represent the largest cooperative project in human history. Friedrich Hayek said he's a Nobel Prize economist, and he said that without an order being issued, without more than perhaps a handful of people knowing the cause, tens of thousands of people whose identity could not be ascertained by months of investigation are made to use the material or its products more sparingly. That is, they move in the right direction. This is what a market does. A market brings the people together without individuals knowing each other, but a market is able to take an economy in the right direction. The market is like a fine-tuned machine that sends messages about scarcity of goods, but nobody designed it, nobody controls it. In Unit 7, we show that when firms have the power to set prices, markets fail to maximize total surplus. In other words, in the presence of a monopoly, a market is inefficient. This is because it does not maximize total surplus. In Unit 8, we show that when firms operate in a perfectly competitive markets, or when there is perfect competition, markets maximize total surplus. In Unit 12, we show that even competitive markets fail when market transactions impact others. In other words, a perfectly competitive market will fail if there is an external impact. One example of a market failure is antibiotic resistance. The WHO warns we are headed to a post-antibiotic era as bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. And to quote the WHO, they say that unless we take significant actions to change how we produce, prescribe, and use antibiotics, the world will lose more and more of these global public health goods, and the implications will be devastating. The overuse of antibiotic or the misuse of antibiotics is what we call a social dilemma. And social dilemmas is what we looked at in Unit 4, where individuals take actions pursuing their own self-interest without carefully thinking about how their actions impact others. In the case of antibiotics, every purchase of antibiotics ostensibly benefits the buyer and the seller, but the buyer and seller often overlook the impact of their actions on others, and hence we have a social dilemma. This is a market failure because the competitive equilibrium produces too much antibiotics. So if we were to allow the market to proceed freely, the perfectly competitive equilibrium would produce too much antibiotics. And this is because as buyers and sellers, we are only thinking about our well-being, and we are not thinking about how our actions impact others. So the perfectly competitive market the outcome will be a Nash equilibrium. However, in the case where we have a market failure, the competitive equilibrium will be Pareto inefficient. So that answers the question as to whether or not a competitive equilibrium with a market failure or with an externality is efficient or inefficient. And the answer is a competitive equilibrium with an externality is Pareto inefficient. Let's move on to some other examples of market failures. A common one is pollution, and we all know about pollution. The pesticide chlordine was used to kill banana weevil in Guadeloupe. The pesticide benefited the banana plantations. However, it devastated coastal fisheries and also damaged people's health. So we see that by the use of chlordicone, my apologies, the use of chlordicone benefited the users who are the banana plantation owners. However, the use of chlordicone had an external impact on fishers and also public health. The plantations did not own the fisheries, so they ignored the external costs they imposed on the fishers. The United States banned chlordicone in 1976. The French government, however, did not ban it in Guadeloupe until 1993 due to pressure from banana producers. So here again, we have a market that has a negative externality. So the market for bananas has an externality, and in this market, there will be an overproduction of bananas because banana producers are not taking into consideration the impact of their actions on others. Market failure, antibiotic resistance, and pollution are similar. The problem is that actors do not take account of the cost of their decisions on others, and the solution is to regulate actions that impose costs on others or to force a decision maker to bear those costs. So for the competitive market to work well, institutions must protect property rights and enforce contracts. Some goods, however, are not easily bought and sold. For example, if we think about antibiotic effectiveness or clean water, these are goods that are not easily bought or sold. So institutional response include professional guidelines for the prescription of antibiotics and environmental regulations or Pygmalion taxes. We will get into these institutional responses as we proceed further in this lecture. But for a minute, let's take a look at externality and look at how externalities will impact the perfectly competitive market. So yes, we're going into graphs. We have the marginal private cost, and this marginal private cost is the cost to the banana producers. So the private costs are to the banana producers, and we can shorten marginal private cost and calling it MPC. We have another cost. So in the case where we have an impact on other persons outside of the banana producers, we have another cost. This other cost is called a marginal external cost, and this is the external cost of producing bananas. So this could be the cost to fishermen or the cost to public health. This is called the marginal external cost of producing bananas, and this is shown graphically. In the case of the use of the pesticide for the bananas, we have what we call a negative externality. So weevil is a pesticide used in banana production, but it causes a negative externality, meaning that it impacts others outside of the banana producers negatively. The social cost is the sum of the private cost and the external cost. In other words, the social cost, marginal social cost, is going to be equal to MPC plus MEC. If the market for bananas is perfectly competitive, what will the equilibrium quantity be? So will the equilibrium quantity be chosen where price is equal to the marginal private cost, or will the equilibrium quantity chosen be equal to where price is equal to the marginal social cost? In the scenario where we have a negative externality like the situation in Guadeloupe, the equilibrium is going to be found where the price is equal to the marginal private cost. So the equilibrium in this market will be at point A. So the banana producers are not taking into consideration the impact of their actions on others. So the equilibrium quantity that they will choose will be where the market price is equal to their marginal private cost. So if the market price is 400, the banana producers will supply 80,000 tons, and that is at point A. At this point, the banana producers are in fact maximizing producers' profits. However, this equilibrium is inefficient. So again, the equilibrium found where the marginal private cost is equal to the market price is inefficient. In the case of an externality, whenever we choose a quantity such that price is equal to marginal private cost, the equilibrium is inefficient. This is because the last ton of bananas is worth $400. However, what is the cost to society of that last ton of bananas? If we were to add together the external cost of the production of bananas along with the marginal private cost of the production of bananas, we will get a marginal social cost of $670. So the last ton of bananas is worth only $400. However, it costs society $670 to produce that last ton of bananas. Hence, we have an inefficient equilibrium where the worth of the bananas is less than the cost to society. And this cost is likely borne by fishermen. So let's look at the situation where this external cost is borne by fishermen. In this scenario, the fishermen are willing to pay plantation owners to reduce production. And the fishermen would be willing to pay plantation owners until the price is equal to the marginal social cost. So that will be until it is 38,000 tons, where the market price of 400 is equal to the marginal social cost. External costs and bargaining. So we hinted that the fishermen would be willing to pay the banana producers until quantity is reduced to 38,000 tons. The fishermen gain a lot by reducing production to 38,000 tons. So we have the gain for the fishermen being that area above the price of 400 and below the marginal social cost curve. The plantations, however, lose a little bit of profit by reducing production from 80,000 tons to 38,000 tons, and that is represented by that blue area below the market price and above the marginal private cost curve. So that blue area represents the loss of profits to the plantation owners. Reducing production to 38,000 tons maximizes the net social gain. So if the plantations own the fisheries, they would have produced at 38,000 tons from the start. Producing at 38,000 tons maximizes net social gain. So in this scenario, if the banana producers reduce their production from 80,000 to 38,000 tons, this would not cause any harm to society. It would in fact benefit society, and society would have a net social gain. Suppose, however, it is legal to use weave or kill. A represents the reservation option of plantation owners and fishers. Both plantation owners and fishers would be better off reducing banana production to 38,000 tons if the fishers paid the owners more than the loss of profits, but less than the loss of profits plus the net social gain. So if we were in a situation where there could be bargaining between the fishermen and the banana producers, and the banana producers had the legal right to use the weevil kill pesticides, then both the plantation owners and the fishermen would be better off by reducing production to 38,000 tons if the fishers paid the banana plantation owners more than the loss of the profits that they would have to endure, but less than the sum of the loss of profits and the net social gain. So here's a situation where we can solve this problem of the negative externality by bargaining between the two parties. This equilibrium, if this bargaining takes place, the point at which banana producers will be producing 38,000 would now be Pareto efficient. So if bargaining is able to take place and the banana producers reduce their production to 38,000 tons, that point would be an efficient equilibrium. External costs and bargaining. In theory, when property rights are well defined, bargaining can resolve market failures. So this idea that the fishermen can pay the banana producers to reduce banana production sounds good in theory. So we can have bargaining resolving market failures, for example, pollution, antibiotic resistance, and even underinvestment in education. And that sounds good in theory. However, in practice, most market failures cannot be solved through bargaining, and this is due to impediments like how many people are involved in this bargaining decision. So think of a situation where we are trying to resolve the market failure of pollution. We have many individuals involved in that type of decision. So the number of people involved can act as an impediment to bargaining. We also have problems like missing information about the size, source, and incidence of the external costs. And pollution, for instance, air pollution is one of those market failures that there's a lot of missing information about the size or the incidence of this external cost. There's also difficulties enforcing the bargaining. So if we brought the banana producers and the fishermen together, who is going to enforce whatever bargaining contract that they come up to? So there might be difficulties on that end, and there also may be limited funds for one party to compensate the other. So if the fishermen were to compensate the banana producers for the profits that they would have lost if they reduced their production, where would the fishermen find these funds to compensate the banana producers? So these are all problems that may occur and may lead to bargaining not solving a market failure. We however, have other ways of resolving market failures. So let's now look at external costs, regulation, and taxes. So outside of bargaining, we can solve market failures through regulation and also through taxes. So again, let's look at the external cost of producing bananas. So the external cost is going to be that shaded area, and the external cost is the difference between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost. So in other words, the marginal social cost is a sum of the marginal external cost and the marginal private cost. What if the government could solve this market failure by regulating the amount of bananas produced or by taxing the production or sale of bananas? If the government taxed the production or sale of bananas, the optimal tax would generate the efficient quantity of 38,000 tons, where the marginal private cost is going to be equal to 295, the marginal external cost is 105, and this brings the marginal social cost to 400. So In this scenario, the banana plantation owners would be maximizing their producer profits using the after-tax price that they would receive for their bananas. So the after-tax price would be 295, and at an after-tax price of 295, the banana producers would only be willing to supply 38,000 tons of bananas. This equilibrium is efficient. So if the government were able to impose a tax on banana production, they would impose an optimal tax of 105. And with this tax of 105, banana producers would produce only 38,000 tons. Given that the market price is 400, at 38,000 tons, the tax revenues that the government would get from a $105 tax would be $4 million. So if you take 38,000 tons times the price per the tax per ton that the government is going to get, which is the MEC 105, then the government would get tax revenues of $4 million. So as you can see here, an optimal tax would be a tax that is equal to the marginal external cost of production of the good. Again, the optimal tax is equal to the marginal external cost of production of the good. The tax ensures that plantations face the full marginal social cost of their decisions. This type of tax, where the optimal tax is equal to the marginal external tax, is what we call a Pygothian tax. So Alfred Pygot was one of the first neoclassical economists to focus on welfare economics. And neoclassical economics focuses on material welfare, but Pygot was also interested in political freedom and relative status. Pygot suggested that taxes or subsidies can ensure that individual interests serve the interests of society. And with a Pygothian tax, individuals are forced to pay the full social cost of their actions on society, and this increases welfare. And this is why a Pygothian tax will be exactly equal to the marginal external cost of an action. Let's look at institutions. So one way that this externality, or in other words, this social dilemma, can be solved is by enforcing a tax. Let's now look at how institutions can get us to this efficient equilibrium. So many institutions ensure the efficiency of production and ensure the efficient quantity of bananas is produced, but they distribute the costs and benefits differently. We have institutions like government regulations, private bargaining with the right to pollute, Pygothian taxes, and the polluter pay principles. What if the government imposed an institution where the polluter pays the government? The polluter would pay the government the area between, as we said, the price that the producers would get for the banana and the market price. So the government would get that area. So if the government imposes a policy where the polluter pays the government, or in other words, the government taxes the polluter and the polluter has to pay the government, then the tax would be equal to the area between the price that the banana producer gets and the market price of the good. What if instead the polluter pays the fishers? So this is another type of institution where the polluter would pay the fishers. We can see the area from that graph that the polluter would actually pay the fisher the area between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost of banana production. So the banana producers would produce the efficient quantity, and they would pay the fishermen the area between the marginal social cost curve and the marginal private cost curve. External costs as incomplete contracts. External effects and incomplete contracts are two sides of the same coin. What is the external effect in the labor market? what is the incomplete contract in the banana market? If we look at back at the labor market, we said that labor markets are characterized by incomplete contracts because employers are not able to contract effort of employees. That's one of the reasons that we said that employment contracts are incomplete contracts. In this banana market, what is the incomplete contract? In this banana market, we look at the fact that the producers are causing an external impact, and that external impact is not accounted for in their decision making as well. And therefore, we have an incomplete contract in the banana market. Climate change represents a very large externality, and it's also a very incomplete contract with future generations. So the idea is that our generation today is in essence signing a contract with future generations that we will preserve the earth for them. But in this contract that we are signing with the future generations, there is nothing written in that contract about our protection of the environment, how much carbon emissions we release into the atmosphere. So because that's not written in the contract. For instance, in this contract with future generations, we don't say that, okay, we are going to release only 25,000 tons of carbon over this entire span of our generation, because we in fact don't know the amount of carbon that we are going to release. And because of that, this contract that we are in essence signing with the future generations is incomplete. Carbon taxes is one way of resolving that incomplete contract that we are signing with the future generation. Nobel Prize laureate William Nordhaus, he estimates that taxing carbon at 230 per ton would limit warming to 2.5 degrees Celsius. So with the future generation, because we are trying as much as possible to make our contract complete, what we would do is try to limit warming in our current generation. And Nordhaus suggests that taxing carbon at $230 per ton would limit warming to 2.5. Here we have an example of a marginal social cost curve that is constant, because for every ton of carbon that you release, you are paying $230. So this is a constant marginal external cost. $100 per ton of carbon dioxide is equal to $1 per gallon. What do you think about that? Do you think that this $100 per ton of carbon being approximately equal to $1 per gallon is too much? What if we were to take William Nordhaus's estimate and implement that? How many dollars per gallon would $230 per ton of carbon be? Would you be willing to pay that amount to reduce warming to 2.5 degrees Celsius for future generations? If you're interested in economics, there's a lot more to economics than Econ 202. Climate issues is one of the things that we look at in economics, and there are many other issues. In particular, I study natural resources and environmental economics, so I'm very interested in climate change and also in the use of natural resources. You may want to think about studying health economics. There are economists in the department who are gender economists. So if you want to study economics, there's a lot more than Econ 202. Check out this video and let me know if you're thinking about continuing your studies in economics.